The first time I saw her, she was leaning against a bookshelf in the corner of the cafe, her fingers lightly grazing the spines of old novels as if she were trying to read their stories with her touch. She had that kind of presence that made everything else in the room fade away without her doing a thing. Her hair was a soft chestnut, streaked with silver in the sunlight filtering through the window, falling gracefully over her shoulders. She looked to be in her early 40s, but there was an elegance and quiet confidence about her that made age irrelevant. I approached cautiously, because there was something in the way she held herself, poised yet guarded, that made me aware of my own inexperience. Our first words were clipped, casual, almost accidental. "Your trouble," she said without looking at me, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips, both amused and wary. I laughed nervously, unsure whether she was joking, flirting, or warning me. That line, so simple yet charged, set my pulse racing in a way I wasn't used to. As we spoke, I noticed how her hand brushed against a nearby book as she gestured, the movement deliberate and elegant, and how her eyes briefly flicked to mine, curious, assessing. Every subtle shift of her posture, a tilt of the head, a soft exhale, seemed to pull me closer, though we remained strangers. I became acutely aware of the quiet rhythm of the cafe, the low hum of conversation, the clink of coffee cups, the scent of roasted beans mixing with the faint perfume she wore, something warm, earthy, with a whisper of vanilla. When she finally met my gaze, it was brief but intense, like a spark flaring in a quiet room. There was humor in her eyes, but also caution, a silent question: "How far will you go?" I wanted to lean closer, to hear her laugh in a more intimate tone, but I restrained myself, aware of the tension building between us. Every pause in the conversation felt weighted, every brush of her fingers on the table edge or against a book seeming to communicate more than words could. By the time I left that cafe, I realized that the encounter had unsettled me in the best way, a mix of exhilaration, curiosity, and hesitation. She had called me trouble, but in the flicker of her smile and the lingering glance as I walked out, there was permission for something more, something unspoken. That brief connection, fragile and electric, left me thinking about her long after, setting the stage for a slow, inevitable pull toward the vulnerability and intimacy I could sense lurking beneath her composed exterior. A few days after our first encounter, I ran into her again, not by accident though it felt like it. She was carrying a stack of documents, her arms full, walking briskly along the narrow sidewalk, a hint of frustration in the crease of her brow. I instinctively stepped forward. "Here," I offered, taking a few papers from her hands. Her eyes met mine, sharp, assessing, but there was a softness there I hadn't noticed before. "You're always showing up when you shouldn't be," she said, half scolding, half amused. Her voice held that same warmth that lingered in my memory, but beneath it, there was vulnerability, a quiet acknowledgement that she needed help and didn't entirely mind my intrusion. As we walked together, the air carried the smell of rain from earlier in the day, mixing with the faint scent of her perfume, earthy and slightly floral, comforting yet intoxicating. My hand brushed against hers once as we adjusted our grip on the papers, and the brief contact sent an unexpected warmth up my arm. It was subtle, almost accidental, but it lingered longer than it should have, and I caught a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She laughed softly at something I said, leaning slightly toward me in a way that made me aware of the tiny gap between us. That laugh, low and easy, filled the space around us and created a small bubble where nothing else existed. I noticed her subtle movements, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to another, how her fingers occasionally fiddled with the edge of a sleeve, small signs of attention she didn't fully voice. And yet, despite her words warning me away, I felt her allow me closer than I ever expected. We paused at a crosswalk, standing side by side. The warmth of her presence pressed against me almost imperceptibly. For a moment, I imagined the sound of her heartbeat, though I knew it was impossible to hear over the city's noise. Still, the pause stretched longer than it should, weighted with unspoken curiosity and a mutual awareness that we were tiptoeing along an invisible line. When she finally turned to face me, there was a flicker of something, a silent acknowledgement that she was both wary and intrigued. Her gaze softened, just slightly, a crack in the confident facade she carried so effortlessly. In that moment, I realized she had let me inside, however small the opening, despite her warnings. And I, too, felt the quiet pull of trust, of connection, of something neither of us could yet name. By the time we parted, the tension between us was tangible, like electricity hanging in the air. I walked away with a strange mix of exhilaration and restraint. She had called me trouble again, but this time, the words came with an invitation, a tentative, unspoken opening for something deeper. And I knew, even then, that I would return. The third encounter didn't feel like chance. We ended up sitting on a worn wooden bench in the park near the cafe where we first met, the late afternoon sun slanting through golden leaves. She had a notebook in her lap, a pen poised but idle, and I realized she was lost in thought, a side of her I hadn't yet seen. I hesitated before speaking, aware of the delicate atmosphere, then offered a small story from my own life, a memory from childhood, awkward and unpolished yet honest. She looked at me, eyes reflecting a quiet amusement and curiosity, then shared one of her own stories, about a mistake she had made in her 20s, the kind of story that revealed courage but also an intimate vulnerability. For the first time, the age gap felt less like a barrier and more like a quiet bridge between our experiences. Her laugh, soft and melodic, punctuated her story, but there was a tremor in her voice at certain parts, subtle hints of insecurity she didn't quite hide. I leaned slightly forward, listening not just to the words but to the rhythm of her breathing, the small gestures, how she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the way her fingers rested lightly on the notebook cover. Our conversation meandered naturally. We talked about books, music, even the fleeting frustrations of daily life. Each story, each shared memory, built a lattice of trust between us. I noticed how her shoulder brushed mine when she laughed at a shared joke, the contact so light it might have been accidental, yet it lingered in my awareness far longer than the physical sensation warranted. The warmth of her presence settled around me like a gentle embrace, drawing me closer without words. At one point I reached to hand her a pen she had dropped, and our fingers brushed. That touch was almost electric, sending a ripple of awareness through both of us. Neither of us pulled back, and I realized that the proximity, the shared space, and the quiet trust we had built allowed such moments to carry weight without fear. Her eyes met mine then, a soft smile playing at her lips, and for the briefest second, the world shrank to just the two of us. The encounter ended as the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the path. We lingered in hesitation, reluctant to leave the intimacy we had created, even in this small, everyday moment. As she stood to go, she paused, letting me see a trace of warmth, a hint that she felt the same quiet pull. Walking away, I sensed something unspoken had shifted, an opening had been made, fragile yet real, setting the stage for the deeper connection that was slowly, inevitably, forming between us. The day left me with a profound sense of anticipation, knowing that we had crossed a threshold. Words alone couldn't capture it. It was in the pauses, the glances, the shared laughter, and the subtle touches that spoke louder than anything either of us said. And in that quiet understanding, the slow burn of something significant, emotional, tender, and possibly transformative, had begun. Our connection deepened in the days that followed, unfolding in quiet, unassuming ways. It was during a shared walk through a narrow, rain-slicked street that I first realized how magnetic her presence had become. She moved with deliberate grace, her heels clicking softly against the wet pavement, her hair damp at the ends from the lingering drizzle. The city around us felt muted, as if the world itself had slowed to accommodate the intimacy building between us. We walked side by side close enough that the warmth of her arm brushed against mine occasionally. Each accidental touch sent a subtle shiver through me, a silent reminder that our proximity was charged with something more than friendship. When she adjusted her scarf, her fingers lingered a second longer than necessary near my hand. I caught the faintest brush of her skin, soft and fleeting, but enough to make my pulse spike. At a small cafe along the route, we paused to dry off. She removed her coat and hung it over the back of the chair, and I noticed the small details I had never really seen before. The way the fabric draped over her shoulders, the gentle curve of her neck, the quiet steadiness in her posture. Sitting opposite her, I found myself drawn not just to her beauty, but to the calm confidence she radiated even in her subtle vulnerabilities. We talked, laughed softly, and sometimes lapsed into companionable silence. In those quiet moments, I noticed how close our knees had drawn together under the table, how the heat from our bodies seemed to mingle without words. At one point, her hand brushed against mine while reaching for her cup. Neither of us pulled away immediately. Instead, we lingered, sharing a brief, warm connection that conveyed more than conversation ever could. Her eyes met mine, and in them was a mixture of amusement, curiosity, and something like trust, a silent acknowledgement that our bond was growing deeper. Later, as we walked out into the drizzle again, I offered her my coat. She accepted it with a smile, but our hands met in the motion, and the contact lingered longer than necessary. The warmth of her fingers against mine was like a quiet tether, a reassurance that we were both navigating the delicate balance of closeness and caution. Even in these small, seemingly mundane moments, the tension between us was tangible. The casual brushing of hands, the shared warmth, the way we instinctively mirrored each other's movements, all of it created an unspoken intimacy that neither of us fully articulated. I realized that each touch, each glance, each pause in conversation was slowly weaving a tapestry of trust and attraction. By the time we parted that evening, I felt a mix of exhilaration and calm, a rare combination that comes from knowing you are not alone in curiosity or longing. She had allowed me into her space, both physically and emotionally, and in doing so, had deepened the quiet pull between us. The slow burn of attraction was no longer subtle, it was tangible, lingering in every accidental touch and every shared smile, waiting to grow into something neither of us could yet name. That evening, we found ourselves sitting on the balcony of her apartment, the city lights stretching out beneath us like scattered stars. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain and the warm undertone of her perfume, familiar now, comforting, intoxicating. We had been talking for a while, but the conversation had quieted, the space between words filled with a tangible anticipation. She spoke first, almost in a whisper, revealing a fear she had carefully guarded, the hesitation to trust someone new, someone younger, someone who could challenge her in ways she wasn't ready to admit. Her eyes were fixed on the distant lights, but I could feel the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor of her hands resting on her knees. I wanted to reach out, to reassure her with something more than words, but I hesitated, knowing this was her moment to decide whether she would let me in. I shared a fear of my own, the uncertainty of being understood, of being taken seriously despite my youth, of stepping too quickly into a connection that demanded patience and care. Our voices overlapped in a quiet, tentative rhythm, each revelation echoing the other. The vulnerability between us was like a fragile thread stretching across the distance we had traveled together, delicate but unbreakable if handled with care. Our hands found each other almost by instinct. Hers rested lightly atop mine, the warmth of her skin grounding me. It was not a dramatic gesture, but in its subtlety, it carried a depth of trust and longing. Her fingers twitched slightly against mine, a nervous yet deliberate connection, and I felt an unexpected jolt of closeness, a reminder that we were choosing this intimacy together, wordlessly, deliberately. We spoke little after that, but the unspoken words were louder than anything we could articulate. Every glance, every subtle shift of posture, every breath shared in the cool night air conveyed the growing tension between us. I noticed the way her gaze lingered on my face, searching, curious, and perhaps silently asking whether I could accept all of her past, her hesitations, her guarded heart. The balcony felt like a cocoon, a private space removed from judgment, expectation, and the noise of the outside world. And in that quiet, I realized the depth of my own desire, not physical, but emotional, a yearning to understand her completely, to be present in the small, significant ways that mattered most. When she finally rose to retreat inside, her fingers brushed mine again, deliberate this time, a silent promise that she was allowing me closer. The tension remained, unresolved but heightened, leaving both of us suspended in anticipation. The slow burn of our connection had intensified, the emotional stakes rising, and I knew that whatever came next would demand courage, patience, and mutual trust. In that moment, the unspoken confessions bound us more tightly than words ever could, a delicate dance of vulnerability, longing, and the quiet acknowledgement that we were both stepping into something rare and fragile, yet profoundly compelling. The tension that had been quietly building between us came to a head on a rainy evening. I had stopped by her apartment, hoping for the usual warmth of her company, only to find a note slipped under the door. She wasn't ready. My chest tightened as I read it, the words polite but firm, a reminder of the invisible barriers she had carefully constructed around her heart. I waited outside, unsure whether to knock or give her space, the drizzle soaking my hair and clothes, the city around me muted by the rain. When she finally appeared in the doorway, her expression was conflicted, a mixture of longing, fear, and self-restraint. Her eyes met mine, and in them, I saw the internal struggle I had begun to sense over our past encounters. She was torn between desire and caution, between the pull of intimacy and the risk it carried. I stepped closer slowly, careful not to overwhelm her. "I'm here," I said softly. My voice carried reassurance, not demand. She took a hesitant step forward, and the space between us seemed charged with anticipation. Her fingers hovered near mine, uncertain, almost testing whether I would retreat or remain. The slightest contact, her hand brushing against my wrist, sent a ripple of warmth through me. It was delicate, yet it spoke volumes. We spoke in halting sentences, admitting fears we hadn't voiced before. She worried about appearances, about rushing into something that could hurt both of us. I acknowledged my own uncertainty, the fear of overstepping and losing the fragile trust she had allowed me to share. And in that delicate exchange, the unspoken understanding between us became clear. We were choosing this, together, cautiously, intentionally. Her hand finally rested in mine, fingers interlacing with a tentative firmness that betrayed both vulnerability and courage. I felt her pulse against my palm, quickened yet steady, and realized that this small act of trust was more powerful than any words. The air between us seemed to hum with the weight of possibility, the quiet acknowledgement that we were both stepping into unknown territory, but willing to risk it. The crisis, however subtle, had forced clarity. We both recognized that to remain apart would be a greater pain than any fear of closeness. The rain continued to fall around us, a rhythmic accompaniment to our tentative embrace, the world outside fading as we focused on the fragile, precious connection between us. When she finally leaned slightly toward me, resting her head briefly on my shoulder, it was a quiet surrender, not a dramatic gesture, but profoundly intimate. The slow burn of attraction, curiosity, and trust had reached a threshold. We had faced the possibility of rejection, the fear of vulnerability, and had chosen instead to allow ourselves closer. In that moment, I felt the gravity of what we had begun, a bond built on mutual respect, patience, and the shared courage to let someone in. The next morning, I found her sitting at the small kitchen table in her apartment, sunlight streaming softly through the window, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. She looked up as I entered, a gentle smile playing at her lips, the kind of smile that carried relief, curiosity, and the quiet acknowledgement of a connection that had grown far beyond casual encounters. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft, carrying a warmth that made the room feel smaller and more intimate, cocooned from the outside world. I moved closer, carrying a mug of coffee, the scent rich and familiar, and she watched my movements with a quiet attentiveness. The air between us was filled with unspoken understanding. No words were needed to convey the tentative closeness we had cultivated over weeks of shared moments, touches, and glances. She gestured to the chair opposite her, but instead, I pulled up a stool next to her, deliberately closing the space between us. Her shoulder brushed mine as I settled in, and the contact, though casual, carried a comforting warmth. I noticed the subtle rise and fall of her breath, the way her fingers rested lightly on the table, almost reaching for mine. Slowly, hesitantly, our hands intertwined, a gentle clasp that felt like an unspoken promise. We didn't rush to speak. Instead, we allowed ourselves the quiet luxury of presence, the sensation of skin against skin, the rhythmic warmth of our fingers pressed together, the subtle tension of two hearts acknowledging each other's existence fully. She leaned slightly into me, her head resting lightly against my chest, and for the first time, I could feel the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat beneath my own. The sound was soothing, grounding, and profoundly intimate without needing a single word. Conversation flowed eventually, easy and soft, layered with humor and curiosity, but never hurried. We spoke of plans, small, everyday things, yet every sentence was enriched by the unspoken knowledge of how deeply we had allowed ourselves to connect. Her eyes occasionally flicked up to mine, and I caught in them a mix of trust, admiration, and gentle amusement. Later, as we moved to the balcony to watch the sunset, she leaned into me again, our shoulders touching comfortably. Fingers intertwined, we traced idle patterns on each other's hands, the contact simple yet electrifying. The city below, once overwhelming, now felt distant, irrelevant compared to the quiet warmth between us. In that serene moment, I realized the story had reached its natural conclusion, the slow burn of attraction, the careful navigation of fear and hesitation, the tender moments of vulnerability, all culminating in a connection that was mutual, respectful, and deeply satisfying. She had let me inside, not recklessly, but intentionally, and I had met her trust with the same care. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we sat together in quiet contentment, sharing smiles, warmth, and the profound understanding that we had found something rare. It was not a love defined by grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but by patience, intimacy, and the quiet joy of being fully seen and accepted. The story closed not with fireworks, but with the soft, enduring glow of hearts entwined, a slow-burn connection finally embraced.